Good afternoon, students, faculty, and community members, and welcome to the School of Policy Studies weekly speaker series, Policy Talks. My name is Nora Lobb, and it is my pleasure to be able to introduce the host for this week's Policy Speaker Series. We are very fortunate to have Keith Banting here with us today. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Indigenous territory on which we have the privilege of meeting. The territory Kingston sits on has been the site of human occupation for thousands of years and is the homeland of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. Now, I would like to introduce Keith Banting, our speaker today. He is the Stauffer Dunning Fellow in the School of Policy Studies and Professor Emeritus and Queen's Research Chair Emeritus in the Department of Policy Studies here at Queen's University. He received his doctorate from Oxford University and taught at the University of British Columbia for 13 years before coming to Queen's. Dr. Banting's research focuses on politics of social policy with particular interest in two areas, the politics of inequality and the relationship between multiculturalism and social solidarity. The title of this week's lecture is A Progressive's Dilemma, the Politics of Immigration, Diversity, and Social Policy in Canada. This talk aims to answer if there is a tension between diversity and support for social programs that redistribute income to the less advantaged. This talk is sure to get us thinking and asking questions. Please use Slido to ask these questions using the hashtag MPA19. You can submit your questions by going to the Slido site directly or using the app on your phone. You can ask questions throughout the talk, and they will show on the screen once Dr. Banting has finished his presentation. As in the past, we will post the questions with the most votes. We will also take a few questions from the crowd. Now please join me in welcoming Dr. Keith Banting.
Thank you very much, Nora. And thank you to the committee for inviting me to talk today. My talk today is going to be a little different than some of the other talks in the series, which have provided a broad sort of overview of a particular policy sector and debates that are ongoing. I'm going to inflict a more research-oriented talk on you today. You can think of this, if you will, as sort of the kind of angst that I've been thinking about over the last decade in various forums, and I will present some recent survey research later on in the talk. The central question, as Nora suggested, I've capsulated in the phrase a progressive dilemma. Diversity, and I've changed the second word in the subtitle from that which was announced, shared membership and social policy in Canada. The idea of a progressive dilemma tries to articulate the view that there is some deep tension between diversity on one hand and support for redistribution, support for social programs that transfer resources to the less well-off, and in particular, transfers resources to minorities or people who are not seen as part of us. This idea that social policy at some deep level is rooted in a sense of a shared community, rooted in a sense of a common culture and commitment to one another, is a long-standing one. Perhaps one of the earlier articulations of this view was by T.H. Marshall, a British sociologist who wrote in 1950 that the development of the British welfare state in the middle of the 20th century, he argued, requires, quote, a direct sense of community membership based on loyalty to a civilization that is a common possession, end of quote. Now, that's a language that we would no longer use, but the essential proposition is that the development of social programs and their maintenance over time requires the sense of a common community to support them. Many commentators in the last 20 years have argued there's a deep tension between growing diversity driven by higher levels of immigration in the contemporary era and by the mobilization of ethnic minorities in many countries, sub-state nations in many countries. There's a deep tension between this growing diversity in Western nations and the sense that there is a common community, a sense that there is a common us which will support redistribution. This tension, or the argument that there's a tension between the two, takes two forms. One is an argument that as a society becomes more diverse, support for redistribution, support for social programs generally declines, and that you can see a weakening of the welfare state flowing from this. The second form, and I've always thought that form of it was kind of not very compelling. The second form of the argument is what has often been dubbed welfare chauvinism, that the majority population, the native-born population, will be happy to continue to support major social programs, but they will want the newcomer, the minority, to be excluded from its benefits. Hence the title, welfare chauvinism. The idea that this is a problem in Western democracies originated in American discourse and American research on the American welfare state experience. And there's no question that the politics of race has run like a constant thread through the analyses of the politics of social policy in the United States. One of the most famous recent versions of that argument was a book by Gillens, who argued in the 1990s in a book titled Why Americans Hate Welfare, that the answer is simple. They hate welfare because it's a program that transfers resources disproportionately to African American, especially single African American mothers, and to other minority members, including Hispanics. So the simple answer to why Americans hate welfare, in Gillen's terms, was racial diversity in the US context. In the 2000s, this idea that there was this underlying tension spread to other countries. The United Kingdom, it became a very active debate in the United Kingdom whether the UK could continue to support a robust welfare state as it became more diverse. And indeed, the very title, a progressive dilemma, was coined in the UK. The idea of the dilemma for progressives is that this is a particular issue on the left, because the left traditionally supported both diversity, supported immigration, supported a kind of multicultural approach to diversity, respecting and celebrating difference on one hand, and supported redistribution from the rich to the poor on the other. And the idea of a progressive dilemma was, you can have one, but you can't have both. Make up your mind on the left which you're going to support. And that argument was articulated particularly in the UK on the left. The argument took a kind of existential form in the context of Scandinavia, where Scandinavians had built the most robust, the most extensive, the most redistributive welfare states, and they had done so in a period when they were strikingly homogeneous in ethnic and religious terms. And the question of whether they could sustain that level of welfare commitment in the context of growing diversity. I mean, countries like Sweden now have close to 20% of the population born outside the country. In that context, it became an existential question because the development of the welfare state was seen as something distinctive to the culture and identity of Scandinavians. And indeed, our research has received far more attention in Scandinavia than it ever has in Canada, which tells you a little bit about the kind of angst, where angst lives on this question. So what about Canada? Is there a progressive dilemma in Canada? Our early research on this question was basically reassuring. We conducted surveys on attitudes towards support for redistribution in neighborhoods which were highly diverse and neighborhoods which were highly homogeneous. We found virtually no difference. We found very little difference across different ethnic and minority groups in their support for the kind of welfare state portion of social policy. On the basis of that, and also because we found relatively limited welfare chauvinism. That is to say, access to social programs in Canada, compared to other countries, is much less likely to be blocked for long periods of time by long residency periods. In the UK today, if you are a non-EU immigrant into the UK, you have no access to any social programs, any social assistance programs for a period of 5 years, and you have to prepay a fee to cover any emergency health care. We don't do that in the main in Canada, with the exception of our pension programs. And so our early research suggested that this is not a tension in Canada. It may be an issue elsewhere, but it's not a tension in Canada. by and large, we have not seen the progressive's dilemma. The 2010 presidential address to the Canadian Political Science Association explored this question directly, concluded it was not a big issue in Canada, and I know that because I gave that address. However, more recent research has painted a less rosy picture, and it has done so because we moved the research beyond the narrow niche of immigration and diversity to include Indigenous peoples. And suddenly the story did not look as reassuring. A number of findings, some by us, some by others, found that there was greater discrimination against Indigenous peoples on the issue of support for redistribution. There was a troubling difference, and that difference was large even in comparative terms, comparable to the difference in level of support in the US of support for programs that distribute to African Americans. It was old data, it was incomplete data, so we decided to take a closer look. To do that in this study, we used something called a deservingus framework. And I'll take a minute to introduce this. So I'm sorry this is going to be a little more research complex, or there's methodology involved here. The framework, the deservingus framework, turns on the idea that the public, when it forms its attitudes about support for redistribution to particular individuals or particular groups, tends to invoke a standard set of criteria. There's 5 criteria which publics across democratic countries tend to rely on. And Europeans have found that there's a similar hierarchy in which groups are deemed to be deserving in terms of these 5 criteria, and which groups are at the bottom of the deservingness index. So scholars like Van Oorschot have found, for example, that in every country in Europe, the elderly come at the top of the deserving hierarchy, and immigrants come at the very bottom in every country in Europe. What we did is we took that framework that they have used and applied it to the Canadian context. So what are these 5 criteria? 2 of the criteria that publics rely on in deciding about whether a group or an individual is deserving of welfare assistance are what I'll call economic conditions. First, need. Is this person or this group in need? Are they truly in need? There's no fraud going on. These people really need help. Are they in need? Second, control. If they're in need, is this a need which has been driven by factors outside their own control? Or indeed, does this reflect the fact that they're not very motivated, they're not very hardworking, or they've made poor life choices? Right? This is a judgmental set of criteria which revolve around what I'm calling economic need. Then there are 3 criteria that publics have been found to use in Europe, and much of this research resonates in the US as well, which are about what I'm calling shared membership. These are judgment criteria which relate to social relations. Identity. Does the person or group see themselves as part of us? That is, does the public think that this group is committed to the country and to its common project? Does it see itself as part of us? Second, attitude. Is the person or group grateful for support? And reciprocity. Reciprocity is a very powerful criteria in people's minds. It is the belief that this person or this group would, having received benefit, in turn support others when their term came, when they could do it. That is, this was a reciprocal relationship. They would contribute to it as well as draw on it in times of need. We call those 3, we've lumped together under a sense of shared membership. So, economic factors and shared community factors, let's call it that. Now, I want to make clear, this framework is not a normative position. No one's arguing that you should. It's ideal that people use these criteria in making judgments. You know, it's not ideal to ask whether minority groups are grateful for support they get if those people have been discriminated against all of their period in the country. There's something odd about that. But these criteria have been found to be powerful in shaping people's attitudes towards support for redistribution, and we wanted to know whether those things are at work in the Canadian context. So in this study, we did a survey last fall, a year ago. We looked at majority perceptions of minorities in Canada: French-speaking Quebecers, Indigenous peoples, immigrants. Now, when I say majority, I mean the Canadian population in general, absent the group being considered. Right? So it's not that we're considering just the attitude or we're only considering the attitudes of a small group. It's Canadians generally thinking about another group. When we make a comparison, the comparison is with people's attitudes towards English-speaking Canadians. But the comparison is the view of the population as a whole, absent that group. So if we're talking about immigrants, it's the views of English-speaking Canadians, French-speaking Canadians, and if there are any Indigenous people in our survey, those as well. Okay? I'll try and explain more clearly the distinction when I put some numbers up. Okay. So this is what we did. So what did we find? I'm going to skip through all the technical details and just go straight to the bottom line. So remember I said there are two sets of criteria that have been found to be powerful persuaders when people think about the deservingness of groups for social support. Right? So let's turn first to the economic ones. Now, here I can explain the distinction I had made a moment ago. The 0 point here represents the attitudes, the perceptions of the population as a whole, the rest of the population of English-speaking Canadians. That's a comparison point, okay? So 0 means that if the group is on this side of 0, they are seen as less deserving than English-speaking Canadians. If the group is on this side of 0, they are seen as more deserving than English-speaking Canadians on that dimension. Okay? Is everyone with me? These are, once again, these are judgments of the population as a whole minus that group. Okay? So, let's walk through this. Immigrants, Aboriginal peoples, French speakers. Okay. Here are the questions we ask to get at these economic conditions. Are they hardworking? Is this group hardworking? Is poverty not their fault? Do they face more discrimination than English-speaking Canadians? Are they worse off economically? And for immigrants, in all of those dimensions, they are deemed to be more deserving of social support than English-speaking Canadians. They are seen as a little less hardworking than English-speaking Canadians, which is very odd. Right? Doesn't fit the standard trope about immigrants being hardworking, but that's the perceptions we uncovered. And on poverty not their fault, that seemed to be more true than English-speaking Canadians. They face more discrimination, massively more true than English-speaking Canadians. They are economically worse off, more so than immigrants. Aboriginal peoples, right? Here, the view that Aboriginal peoples are less hardworking is stronger, and it's more statistically significant. On poverty not their fault, they're seen right at the same point as English-speaking Canadians. And then on facing more discrimination and worse off, they are seen as more deserving than the comparison group, English-speaking Canadians. And then you can see French Quebecers. French-speaking Quebecers are also seen as a little less hardworking. And on the other dimensions, they're seen as more deserving than English-speaking Canadians, but the differences are much smaller. Okay? So I don't know what you think about this, but our reading, and you can correct us, we're still wrestling with what these things actually, what the import is. But my reading of this is on the economic need, on the control, is it their fault that they're poor or not? The evidence is broadly reassuring, with the exception of the one indicator, hardworking. They tend to be at least seen as the same as English-speaking Canadians, and generally more deserving than English-speaking Canadians on the economic need questions. Okay? So compared to the evidence they're finding in other parts of the world, that's not bad. The interesting stuff comes next, shared membership. Remember I said anything to the left of 0 means that you are deemed to be less deserving of social support on this dimension. Anything to the right of 0 means you're more deserving of social benefit support than English-speaking Canadians, a comparison group. And remember, these are the judgments of the population as a whole. So if we're talking about immigrants here, these are the judgments of French and English-speaking Canadians and anyone who happens, Indigenous people who happen to be in the sample. It's a tiny, tiny number. Now, we could go through all the individual questions we ask to get at these dimensions. Do the demands of this group, the policy demands of this group make Canada a better place? Are they patriotic? Do they share Canadian identity? Do they care? Do they do their fair share? Are they willing to sacrifice for other Canadians? That is, on most of the dimensions which measure the extent to which immigrants are seen by the majority population, by the rest of the population, as committed to the Canadian project, they are seen as less so on this set of criteria, what we're calling shared membership. Aboriginal peoples, up here. Once again, the 0 point, I'm sorry, is down here, right? So here's the 0 point. And on every one of these questions, we are once again in the less deserving space. Right? So they're seen as less committed to the Canadian context, to the Canadian community, to Canada in some sense, some vague sense, than English-speaking Canadians. And similarly for French-speaking Quebecers, although the differences here are not as great. Now, this was a surprise to us. It didn't meet our expectations, right? Immigrants are classically seen as joiners. That is to say, in the Canadian context, by and large, when immigrants come to Canada, they want to join the mainstream, and do. There are countries in Europe which have very deeply embedded, segregated communities, but that's not been, by and large, a Canadian story. We have done research which shows that immigrants are the most passionately Canadian. When you ask, how Canadian do you feel, how important is it to be Canadian to you, immigrants tend to be more so than the native-born population. So this was a surprise. They are seen by the population as a whole as less committed to the Canadian community than we expected. At the other extreme, Quebecers, French-speaking Quebecers, here we are. French-speaking Quebecers are seen as more closely, not 100%, more closely committed to the Canadian project. This is a group that came within less than 1% of voting to leave Canada in 1995, right? So we had expected the reverse. Indigenous peoples are in the middle category, and they're much more like immigrants, seen as more distant from and less committed to. And this is a group which is trying to create a separate space, some of whom do not see themselves as Canadians and do not vote. I mean, that would have been a little less, do not vote in the Canadian elections. That would be perhaps a little less surprising. But the fact that immigrants and Indigenous peoples are in the same categories makes us wonder if what's really at work here is race, right? French Canadians, even though they almost left, are seen as closer to Canada, more committed to Canada, more engaged in Canada. And the other two groups, which differ in their approach to integration into the Canadian community, Indigenous peoples increasingly trying to carve out a distinct space within the Canadian state, and immigrants generally wanting to join the mainstream, maybe those differences are less important than the fact that these are racially and religiously distinct peoples. We don't know the answer to this question, and I'd be interested in your responses. But that's what we found. So what have we found? We found that on economic questions, Canadians generally are supportive or deem, so let me rephrase that. Canadians generally deem minorities to be more deserving than English-speaking comparison group on most of the dimensions, excepting one, the hard-working question. But in general, the balance of opinion is that these groups on economic grounds are more deserving than the English-speaking Canadian population. But on the shared membership question, right, does it, are you part of Canada? Are we committed to you? Are you involved in a reciprocal relationship which over time will make this place better? Not so sure. The majority of the population is actually so sure. So then the question becomes, which matters more? Right? When you're looking at support for redistribution and support for social programs. So we decided to measure that, and we have two measures. One is support for what we call inclusive redistribution. So we also ask questions about whether you support redistribution generally, whether you support the welfare state generally, called general redistribution, but our primary concern, and we measure that and we control for that, but our primary concern is what we call inclusive redistribution, where the questions say, do you support the inclusion of minorities in core social programs? Right? It's explicit. Not just do you support healthcare, but do you support the inclusion of minorities in healthcare? We also measured targeted programs. Do you support programs which provide special assistance available not to other groups for the particular problems that these groups face? So we asked about programs to help French Canadians preserve their culture, programs to assist reconciliation in the case of Indigenous peoples, and programs to support the integration of newcomers with language and skills training programming in the case of in the case of immigrant communities. Now, in this analysis, I'm not going to bore you with the analytical details, but we control for a wide range of other factors, social demographic factors, gender, and income, and education, all the things we know support or influence support for social programming, and we control for a variety of other things, including attitudes towards diversity generally, attitudes towards general redistribution. We want to target the inclusive or not, the anti-welfare chauvinism kind of position. And what do we find? Well, there's good news and bad news. The good news is that, let me explain. On this axis, we have the level of support, in this case, for inclusive redistribution. Remember, support for social programs where it's explicitly asked, do you support the inclusion of minorities, this particular minority, in this general social program? Right? And so this is not comparative, this is the straight level of support within the population as a whole. Okay, so what this tells us is the top group here, the group for which there's the most support, is Aboriginal Canadians. The second group are immigrants, and the lowest group is French-speaking Quebecers. So on that dimension, on the relative willingness to support, it strikes us that the reading is that the economic criteria are trumping, right? That perceptions of need, perceptions that this group is discriminated against, perceptions that poverty is not their fault, those perceptions are trumping. But the shared membership criteria can be seen in the slope. So on this axis, we took all those 8 dimensions, collapsed them into a single measure of what we're calling shared membership. And it was easy because they were highly correlated. And so down here we have strength of perceived shared membership. Remember, the perception of the rest of the population that this group is committed, in some sense, to a reciprocal sharing community. Well, if we go back to the Indigenous people or Aboriginal support, for those who are skeptical of the level of commitment, the level of support is considerably lower. For those who are not troubled and see this group as committed to the Canadian project as English-speaking Canadians, the level of support is much higher. And you can see the same trend for immigrants and the same trend line for French-speaking Quebecers, right? So the economic need is trumping in terms of the relative hierarchy. Remember I said there was a standard hierarchy in Europe about who's deserving? Well, the economic considerations seem to be trumping here, but the slight niggling sense that these groups are not fully committed to the society seems to have an effect in mitigating or moderating the level of support. We get the same pattern for targeted. Are you willing to support programs, special programs that target support to this group alone? And you got the same order, rank order, right? Indigenous, immigrant, French speakers. Same tendency to say you're more supportive if you think the group is committed, and indeed that slope is strongest, or the slope is higher in the case of French Canadians. You really want to believe that they're committed to the country if you're going to actually provide support for the preservation of their language. That's perhaps not a complete surprise. Okay, now, these are the raw results, these are the results of the data analysis. So what do we make of them? Do we have a progressive dilemma in Canada? Is diversity eroding support for redistribution? Does it qualify it? Can we conclude, as I concluded in 2010, that this is not an issue in Canada? Well, the good news is the perceptions of economic need, that's badly phrased up there, of economic need, perceptions of economic need are largely positive, and support for redistribution is consistent with that need. The less good news is there are less positive perceptions of the commitment to a shared community than one would have thought, and that these have significant implications for public support for inclusive redistribution and targeted spending. Now, so what? What are the policy implications, if any, of this? Right? How could you shape public conceptions of the engagement of minorities in the Canadian community? Right? Is that possible, where you're in a society which, by its very logic, with sub-state national groups, French Canadians, and Indigenous people wanting a slightly separate relationship to the wider society? How do you frame that in a way which posits that as being a form of commitment to Canada? And I think that's a question we need to ponder. I personally would argue that position, but it's a subtle position, and it may not be a position which everyone grabs onto quickly. The other point, and I guess I'm not sure, so it's especially complex in the case of national minorities. I find the results on immigration and the extent to which they're committed strange. And maybe we'll do further research. There'll be robustness checks to see whether these findings are replicated in the future. But it's a more straightforward case to make, I think, that immigrants over time become committed to Canada, and indeed become, as they naturalize, they become more knowledgeable about Canadian history than many of us. I think that's a more straightforward case to make. National minorities is a more complicated one. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm happy to answer all your questions. And I'd be interested in your reaction, because, as I said, we're still wrestling with this stuff. We haven't fully decided what we should make of it. And I'm curious what you make of it. Some of it makes you squirm. I'll be quite honest, some of this makes us quite uneasy. We have had pushback. Why are you even asking these questions? Will this research make things worse? And our answer to that question is, there are obviously underlying myths and prejudices in the Canadian context, and uncovering them is the first step to challenging them. But that answer has not always been compelling to people who have responded to the very early forms of this work. So I'll stop there. I should say, this is just, I'm one of 4 people on this project. The political theorist here at Queen's, Will Kymlicka, Alison Harrell, who's a very skilled data analyst and student of these issues at UQAM, and Rebecca Wallace, who's a PhD student in political studies, are also co-conspirators on this work.
Sorry, one sec. It should be showing up there. Yeah, let me just. I have to log in. So thank you, Keith, for that really engaging talk. It seems like we have a lot of questions. So the first one we're going to ask today is, what influence do other countries' attitudes towards immigrants and other minority groups have on Canada?
That's a good question, and I do think that Canadians generally, on many issues, are what I'll call attitude takers. That is to say, attitudes, concerns, anxieties in other countries often flow into this country. If there's a populist backlash against immigration in Europe or in the US, the media in Canada quickly start looking for signs that it's happening here, right? And so there's a market for surveys of attitudes, which, if tweaked, you can get Canadians to say some scary things if you frame the questions in a particular way. And so I think that the influence and the issues flow into Canada. I do think that that Canada is exceptional, not in the sense that the pressures at work are any different than elsewhere, but that the mix and the sort of history, the policy structures we have, and the historic culture we have meant that although the issues come into our debates, our responses are not the same as they are in Europe or the US.
Okay, next question. Is there any way to challenge that perception of the other?
I wish I knew the answer to this question. I could get a lot of consulting gigs, but with governments who don't know the answer to the question. And what is striking to me is that governments tend to be quite nervous about programming which is clearly designed to shape Canadian attitudes on these issues. The programming and the imaging and the public relations tend to be very generic, celebrating Canadian diversity at that level of generality. But and citing the image or the sort of the totemic status of the charter and the anti-discrimination features, that it operates at that kind of level. But if there's a particular group which is under stress, governments kind of are very careful about that. So I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that question. It's one of many. I don't know the answer to it. I actually think probably governments have got the mix not bad. Keep pushing on the general structure, the general policy structures we have in place, like the charter. Keep pushing on the general thematic, rather getting down into the specifics of particular anxieties that are out there.
Our next question is, did you ask questions pertaining to how knowledgeable the participant felt they were on the history/truths of these 3 groups, and would they like to have known more?
The answer to that question is yes, we asked, we've not analyzed that question, but we asked them how, a bunch of other questions which I haven't discussed. We asked them we did ask how much they feel or how knowledgeable they feel about the situation facing these groups. We asked them how distant they feel. Right? So do you feel close or distant to these groups? We tried to measure their attitudes towards the group in a variety of ways. We were trying to get a measure of straight racism or xenophobia, and I'm not sure we pulled that off clearly enough, because I think it's partly what's going on here. So the answer is yes, but perhaps not in any detail. You know, just how knowledgeable are you about these, do you feel about these groups, and how distant do you feel from them? And we've used the distance one, we know what its effects are, and interestingly, people feel most distant from Indigenous people, and yet Indigenous people are the ones for whom support for redistribution is highest. So there is a kind of, I should also say, this is not the question I was asked, but I should also say these results on Indigenous people are different than the earlier results I referred to, and that was based primarily on a survey in 2002-03. And so where the Indigenous people in effect came last. And here they're coming first. And so that's actually a hopeful sign over time. Now these are different measures and different studies and different questions, so you can't read too much into it, but my sense is that the debates, the politics, the contestation of the debates about residential schools have mattered to this, because we've got a different rank order. Even if the shared citizenship or shared community stuff is there, we have a different rank order than we had in 2002-03. And so, conflict. Let me go back. How do you change views? I'm obviously rambling, right? But to go back to the question I was asked, how do you change views of the other? I actually think it's not going to happen primarily as a result of government advertising. It's going to happen through political contestation. It's going to happen through political contestations in which the minority groups mobilize and articulate their concerns and challenge myths about them. And without that, and so on that score, I am moderately hopeful over time.
Okay, our next question is, can we see, with the rise of provincial populist premiers, a greater focus on provincial identities over a shared national identity?
I think you have to give two answers to that question. One, an answer about Quebec, and then an answer about the other provinces. We've been tracking this issue in this country for at least 2 generations. This question was very intensively asked, for example, during the constitutional wars of the 1980s and 1990s. Do people in Western Canada think differently about Canada than do people in Atlantic Canada or Ontario? And by and large, the answer to that question was no. They articulated a stronger sense of political commitment to the provincial identity, but they retained they were equally strong in their commitment to a Canadian identity as Canadians from throughout English-speaking Canada. In Quebec, clearly there's a distinct society. Clearly there is a society which thinks of itself as partially part of Canada, partially wanting a sense of capacity to govern itself as much as possible. And so I think that we see these politics being played out today. The debate in Quebec about these issues on certainly the immigration file is very different. On the Indigenous file, I'm not sure the differences are as great, although there's someone here who probably can answer those questions better than I can.
Okay, our next question is, there seems to be a dissonance between the population's perception and the facts. How should this be addressed? Is this a factor in populist politics?
Yeah, well, yeah. I mean, populist politics thrive on misperception and misunderstandings and perceptions which, when you look at them carefully, are wrong. So let me just look at the question again. Dissonance between... I think this has been true for a long time, and I wouldn't see it as unique to this period when we think we have a more populist form of politics, or we do have a more populist form of politics. The gap between public perceptions and what social scientists tell us is the hard evidence has always been large. And I go back to the same observation that in the long term, I think that the best antidote to misperception has to be the mobilization of the groups being misperceived. They shouldn't be framed by others. They should be part of the framing process. And in this country, Indigenous peoples have been robust, and I think we're seeing the effects of that in the change over time. Immigrant groups are relatively robust. French Canadians are, I mean, I think, you know, we have active minority communities in this country, and you can't, I don't think you can count on the majorities to change because the government hasn't. These things change through political contest and conflict.
Now I think we have a question from the crowd in the corner over here.
Yes, thank you very much. I have a suggestion, a thought, and a criticism. The suggestion was if you would covary the data for education and income, you might get very different results, either by segregating the data or just with covariance.
Well, we control for education. In the analysis of support for redistribution,
Oh, you did? Okay.
we control for income, education, gender. These are all power. We know these are powerful things shaping attitudes to social policy. We also control for what I call the distance measure. That is, how distant do you feel from these groups? We're trying to screen out just pure anti-minority attitudes and get at this question of the shared membership. But we did control for those.
The other thought I had was, in Canada, our us group is often very local. So when I go to my son's residence in rural Quebec, I am a foreigner.
Mm-hmm.
When Toronto people come to Kingston, we sometimes see them as foreigners.
When Toronto people
come to Eastern Ontario. And when we go to British Columbia, we are outsiders. So our loyalties in Canada, I think, are provincial or even urban, much more than they are to this nation state.
Yeah, you may be right. We measured at the macro level. We asked questions about commitment to Canada. Are people committed to helping other Canadians when they can? Do they care? And the concept or the community we had in mind was Canada. If we did more fine-grained analysis at smaller community levels, we might well find different results.
It's important, I think, because our welfare system is run by the provinces.
Well, large parts of it are.
Is run by Quebec. So why would Albertans have a thought about how Quebec does its welfare system?
Well, we were asking in general. We weren't asking whether you support social spending by the federal government or whether you support social program spending by the provincial governments. It was just social spending generally. Would we find a different reaction, different results if we said to Albertans, you know, do you think of these groups think of themselves as Albertans, and relate that to support for social program expenditures in Alberta? We might, but I'd be surprised. But it's a question worth asking. Fair enough.
Our next question is, based on the stringent vetting process migrants go through, why do you think there is a negative perception on their work ethic?
Yeah, I don't know. So all the good questions, I don't have answers to any of them. So we were surprised. I mean, I think I've said that. We were surprised by a number of these results. And one possible answer is this has to be checked with other studies, different surveys. We ought to make sure this is not simply inherent in the structure of this particular survey. And we're looking for funding from the federal government from SSHRC to do that. But I think that, so the short answer is I don't know. The answer one of my colleagues would give, Alison Harrell, is that actually this stuff is driven more by racial attitudes than we would like to think in Canada. We don't like to think of ourselves as having these sorts of racial stereotypes. I should say that we've had a debate amongst ourselves about how important the hard-working criteria is as opposed to the in real need, are discriminated against more, and so on. My tendency is to see it as just 1 out of 4, and therefore we put too much weight on it. But in other studies, and certainly in the US, the hard-working question is politically powerful. And so I referred to the studies of American attitudes towards welfare and the extent to which Americans' perceptions of African Americans matter, and the hard-working question is critical in the American debate. So we disagree a little bit amongst the 4 of us on how important that one is. But that's not the question you asked. The question is why, and I don't have a simple answer to that question, but if one of my colleagues was here, she'd say, look, the consistent thing that's running through this, Indigenous people, Aboriginals, they're racially different. Right.
Our next question is, I found it interesting that 3 white men were referenced here with you presenting. What investigations were had into the other identities approach to this research?
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand the question. The 3 white men, it is true that I mentioned Gillens, Van Oorschot, I can't remember anyone else. And so these are merely illustrative. This is a very active field of research, and so it's not a research field which is exclusively occupied by white men. Our team is 50% men, 50% women, although it is true the team is all white, and we're all European descent. I'll start with that. Other identities, approaches to this research. Well, this is I'm not sure whether this is a methodology question. That is, one approach, we've adopted one approach to this, which is to do survey work. Right? We conducted an online survey. Other people study these sorts of questions through more qualitative, ethnographic work, with deep, long interviews or conversations or participation in the lives of a small number of people trying to understand the complexities of the lives they lead. And I read that. I don't do that, but I think it's very good research and is a good second mechanism, so you can sort of triangulate or biangulate on a lot of these issues. But having said that, remember, we are looking at the attitudes of the majority population. We're not looking at the attitudes of the minorities themselves. And so the survey instrument is probably an easier way to get at that and the qualitative work, more ethnographic work, probably has a better fit when you're trying to understand the experiences, the problems, and the barriers facing the minorities themselves, which wasn't our question. We were asking about the misperceptions, the prejudices, the attitudes of the population as a whole about minorities.
Okay.
I don't know if I answered that question because I'm not sure I understood it.
The next question is, are refugees separate from the definition of immigrants? I'm guessing within the study you.
In this survey, no. I mean, clearly in immigration policy, the answer to that question is yes. And in other research, we know that attitudes towards immigrants do vary across the various streams of immigrants. So attitudes to skilled workers is different than attitudes to refugees. This we know in larger public opinion surveys. But in this survey, we simply use the category immigrant. And it's important, in this presentation, we did not break out the category visible minority, right? So in this presentation, the second generation immigrant, even racial minority immigrant, is not in the immigrant category. So the next step in this work is to redo the analysis where we shift from the category, because we did ask attitudes towards visible minorities, to shift from immigrant to visible minority and see if we get the same sort of patterns.
Our next question is, can you comment on the Premier Delegate Francois Legault's proposal to ban people in positions of authority in the province from wearing religious symbols?
Oh, yeah. But I don't think I don't think, I'd have to think about this. I don't know if this survey gives us any leverage on that question, partly because we have not yet broken out, we plan to, Quebec versus the rest. I didn't divide this in that way. But we can and will. Well, I mean, I think that this is a Rorschach test about your basic attitudes towards individual rights and diversity, and I'm clearly much more of a multiculturalist personally. I think the Prime Minister had it right when he said the state shouldn't be telling people what they can wear. And I also think the inconsistencies within the Quebec orientation about the role of historic Catholic symbols on one hand and the symbols of minorities on the other hand are, that's an uncomfortable disjunction. So I'm not a big fan. It will be interesting to see how the courts handle this, because you may not remember. The first big instance of this was the case in the 1980s, which had to do with whether Sikh members of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police could wear a turban in place of the red Stetson when they were in their ceremonial dress. Right? And the courts it looked like the courts were headed towards a very firm yes, that is to come down on the side of the Sikh community wanting to wear turbans in that period. It was never ruled on by the Supreme Court of Canada, but the RCMP decided it was losing at every step along that way, and it therefore stopped appealing decisions and adopted the current provision, which is that Sikhs may wear their turban, Sikh members of the RCMP can wear their turban. This is an old established position, right? So we're talking about police officers. And so if Quebec goes down this road, it may well have to invoke the charter. Yeah, thank you. It may have to take that step and use the override, because the courts, at least so far, have been pretty clear on these questions. The Supreme Court was very clear on the Sikh Durka in cases in Quebec as well. So anyway.
Okay, we have one more time for one more question. Does anyone in the audience here want their question answered, or should I move on to the next question on Slido? Okay. How does the survey population compare to the actual Canadian population?
It's a very good question, because it was an online survey. The answer is it compares very well. It's not identical, and we have to use weights in some areas where we have less than the appropriate, less than an exact representation. So we have to be careful about saying that Canadians think this. We can talk about the relationship between groups of Canadians, given the nature of the sample, but we actually have a slight undercount on the English-speaking Canadians. We oversampled in the other minority groups, and those ones are well represented, but we have to use a slight weight when we're dealing with English-speaking Canadians. So Good question. Always a good question to ask, especially with online surveys.
Okay, and with that, Keith, we would like to thank you for coming to speak with us today on the behalf of School of Policy Studies and the MPA class of 2019. Thank you.
Thank you.